We're going to take a look at reflexes in this video. A reflex is defined as an automatic patterned response to a stimulus. So for example, if you tap on your patellar tendon, you will kick your lower leg out. So you have that knee-jerk reflex. So you get that same response every time you do that. We can categorize our reflexes 4 different ways. We can classify them as either a spinal or cranial reflex. A spinal reflex is going to involve the spinal nerves and spinal cord, while a cranial reflex will involve the cranial nerves and the brainstem. We can also classify our reflexes as being either somatic or autonomic reflexes. A somatic reflex will involve the skeletal muscles, while an autonomic reflex will involve the smooth or cardiac muscles. And then a monosynaptic reflex will just involve one synapse, and a polysynaptic reflex will involve 2 or more synapses. And then the last way to classify a reflex is either being innate or conditioned. An innate reflex is just one that you're born with. You don't have to learn how to do it. So like the knee-jerk reflex, you just automatically know how to do that. You don't have to be taught how to do that. A conditioned reflex is one that you learn later. So kind of a classic conditioned reflex would be like Pavlov's dogs that learned when the bell was rung, they would get a treat. So anytime they heard the bell ring, they would start drooling in anticipation of getting a treat. So that would be a conditioned reflex. Another example of a conditioned reflex would be maybe one time you ate some cottage cheese and you got sick after that and threw up. And so now anytime you try to eat cottage cheese or you smell cottage cheese, you get nauseous. So that would be a conditioned reflex. So that's something that you learned. So here's just a picture of a monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflex. So the monosynaptic reflex, we just have one synapse in between the sensory neuron and then the motor neuron. So there's just the one synapse there. And then a polysynaptic reflex, poly meaning many, we're going to have 2 or more synapses. So you can see there's one synapse here, and then there's a second synapse right there. So there's this inner neuron that is in between the sensory and the motor neuron. And remember, the inner neurons are found in the central nervous system, so they'll either be in the brain or the spinal cord. So this just summarizes the different ways to classify the reflexes, and we'll be talking about these as we go through. So it's really important to know the reflex arc and the 5 different components of a reflex arc. So we've got the sensory receptor. That's going to detect the stimulus. So that'll pick that up. And then we're going to send a nerve signal up the afferent or sensory neuron to the integration center, and the integration center is going to be your central nervous system. So in a reflex, that'll be either the spinal cord or the brainstem. So that'll be your integration center. And then we're going to send a nerve signal out through the efferent neuron. That'll be your motor neuron. And then that'll talk to the effector organ. So that'll be either a muscle or a gland. And then we'll get our response. All right, let's take a look at our first example of a reflex. So this is called the muscle spindle stretch reflex. and also called the patellar or knee-jerk reflex. So I would just be familiar with all three of these names because you could see any of these used in medicine. All right, so I'm sure that we've all had experience with this one before if you've gone to the doctor. They take that little hammer and they will pound on your patellar tendon. And when you push on that patellar tendon, it will stretch your quadriceps muscle. And there's a sensory receptor that's embedded inside the quadriceps muscle. It's called a muscle spindle. And we're going to be talking about these muscle spindles later in chapter 12. And that muscle spindle is a sensory receptor that's going to detect the muscle length and will realize that, hey, the quadriceps muscle length has changed. It's just been stretched. And so it's going to send a nerve signal up the sensory or afferent neuron to the spinal cord. And notice that our sensory neuron here has some collateral axons. So we've got some divergence going on here. So we're going to spread the signal out. So we're going to talk to the motor neuron going to the quadriceps muscle. So we'll have a synapse there. And we're going to tell the quadriceps muscle to contract. And when the quadriceps muscle contracts, that will lift the leg up and you'll kick out. And at the same time, we're also going to synapse with an inner neuron in the spinal cord. And then we'll have a second synapse with the motor neuron going out to the hamstring muscle. And we're going to tell the hamstring muscle to relax and not contract. Because remember, the quadriceps and hamstrings muscles, they're antagonistic to each other. They have opposite effects. So if you want to kick out your leg, we need the quadriceps to contract while the hamstrings relaxes. And then we also will send a signal up to the brain to let you know that someone just was pounding on your patellar tendon. All right, so classifying this muscle spindle stretch reflex or patellar or knee-jerk reflex, is this going to be a spinal or cranial reflex? So hopefully you said that this is a spinal reflex because it involves the spinal cord. And then next, do we have a somatic or autonomic reflex? So this is a somatic reflex. And we know it's a somatic reflex because we're innervating the skeletal muscle. So that's what defines a somatic reflex. And the next, are we going to classify this as a monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflex? This one's kind of tricky. So it's actually going to be both. So the only monosynaptic reflex in the body, and this is something I would remember for the exam, is this reflex going out to the quadriceps muscle. So on this knee-jerk reflex, this synapse going out to the quadriceps muscle, this is the only monosynaptic reflex in the body. That's it. So the muscle spindle stretch reflex, the only one in the body that has a monosynaptic reflex in it. Okay, so you've just got the one synapse between the sensory neuron and then the motor neuron. And then the other one going out to the hamstrings, that one is polysynaptic because you've got two synapses here. You've got a synapse between the sensory neuron and the inner neuron, and then another synapse between the inner neuron and then the motor neuron. So it's both monosynaptic going out to the quadriceps and then polysynaptic going out to the hamstrings. Okay, and then the last classification, is this an innate or conditioned reflex? So this will be an innate reflex. So So you're just born knowing how to do this. You didn't have to learn how to do the patellar reflex. Our next reflex is the withdrawal reflex. So this would be if you touch the hot stove, you burn yourself and you immediately will withdraw your hand. So this reflex, we're going to start with the sensory receptors in the skin. They will pick up the burn pain that you feel, and they will send a nerve signal up through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. We've got lots of divergence going on here. And we're going to talk to the biceps muscle and tell it to contract, to lift your hand up and away from the hot stove. And at the same time, we're also going to talk to the triceps muscle and tell it to relax in order to allow you to lift your hand up and away from the stove. So we'll tell the triceps to contract and tell the triceps to relax. And notice that we've got two synapses here in between the sensory and the motor neuron out to the biceps, and then the same thing, we've got two synapses in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron going out to the triceps. And then the other thing is that we're also going to synapse and cross over here or decussate, and then take the signal up to the brain to let the brain know that you're burning your hand on the stove. And one thing that you probably have noticed about a reflex is that you will pull your hand away really quickly from the stove before you even feel the pain. Okay, because these reflexes are really fast, and that's to prevent you from doing even more damage. And it's going to take a little bit of time for that signal to get up to the brain before you're even aware that you've burned yourself. And that reflex, being so fast, prevents you from doing more damage, because if you had to wait for it to get up to the brain and register that you're burning your hand and then send a signal from the brain down to your arm to move your arm away, you'd do a lot more damage. Okay, so by having all the decisions in the reflex be made right here in the spinal cord, you can get that response a lot faster. And so that's why we have these reflexes, these decisions being made right here in the spinal cord, or if you're up in the brainstem, because you can get that reflex response, done a lot faster than if you had to send the signal to the brain, decide what needs to be done, and come back down with the signals. And so that's why we have these reflexes. So they're there for protection and get a response really, really quickly. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll classify this reflex. So is this a spinal or cranial reflex? So this would be a spinal reflex because it involves the spinal cord. And then is this a somatic or autonomic reflex? So this is a somatic reflex because you're innervating the skeletal muscles. And is this a monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflex? So if we take a look at talking to these muscles here, we've got one synapse, two synapses between the sensory and the motor neuron going out to the biceps. And then we've got two synapses between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron going out to the triceps. So both of those are going to be polysynaptic reflexes. And then is this an innate or conditioned reflex? So this would be innate. Because you're born knowing how to do this, you don't have to be taught how to withdraw your hand if you're burning it. Okay, our next reflex is the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflex. So if you're walking along and then step on a nail, The reflex would be to withdraw that foot that you stepped on the nail with, and then you need to cross over and extend the other leg to support your weight because now you're only standing on one leg. Okay, so withdrawal and crossed extensor. Okay. All right, so this reflex, we're going to start picking up our stimulus, poking your foot with the nail with some pain receptors in the skin, and then they're going to send a nerve signal up the sensory neuron, up to the spinal cord, and we've got lots of divergence going on. And we're going to focus on withdrawing the leg that stepped on the nail first. So we need to talk to our hamstring muscle, and we want to tell it to contract. And that's going to allow you to flex your leg and lift it up, withdraw it from the nail. And then at the same time, we also want to tell the quadriceps muscle to relax, because that'll allow us to withdraw our leg. Okay. So if you look at the number of synapses here, we've got 1, 2 between the sensory and the motor neuron going to the quadriceps. And then we've got 1, 2 synapses between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron going to the hamstring. So we've got polysynaptic reflexes there. And then we're going to decussate or cross over so we can talk to the leg on the other side. So that's a good word to know, decussate. So decussate just means to cross over. So if we look, going over to the other side, we're going to just do the opposite directions, basically. So we're going to talk to the quadriceps muscle, and we're going to tell it to contract. And that'll extend this leg so it can take the body weight. And then we're going to talk to the hamstrings and tell it to relax so it doesn't get in the way. Okay? And we just did the opposite on the other leg, didn't we? So the other leg, we told the hamstrings to contract and the quadriceps to relax. And here we're saying, nope, we want quadriceps to contract and hamstrings to relax. So we're just doing the opposite. And then if we look up here, you can see that talking to the quadriceps, we've got 1 synapse, 2 synapses between the sensory and motor neurons. So that's polysynaptic there. And then talking to the hamstrings, we've got 1 synapse, 2 synapses between the sensory and motor neurons. So that's also polysynaptic there. Okay, and then also we're going to send a signal up to the brain to let us know that we just stepped on a nail and that really hurts. Okay. All right, so let's classify these reflexes. So are these spinal or cranial reflexes? So these would be spinal reflexes because they involve the spinal cord. And would these be somatic or autonomic reflexes? So these would be somatic reflexes because we're innervating skeletal muscle. And then would these be monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflexes? So we just showed that these were all polysynaptic reflexes. And then are these innate or conditioned reflexes? So these will be innate. So you don't have to learn how to do these. You're just born knowing how to do this. Okay, and our last reflex, this is the pupillary light reflex. And you can try this one at home. If you take a little pen light and if you shine the light in one eye, okay, so maybe we shine it in this bottom eye, then both pupils actually end up constricting. So not just the one, but you end up constricting both pupils. So we're going to pick up that light hitting the retina, and our sensory neuron is going to send the signal through our optic nerve, which is one of our cranial nerves. And then we're going to synapse here in the midbrain, which remember the midbrain is part of your brainstem. Okay, and then we're going to synapse a second time here with another cranial nerve that's going to go and innervate the smooth muscle that's in your iris, and we'll tell the iris to constrict because you've got too much light coming into the pupil, and it says, oh, we need to constrict and not let as much light in. And the reason that both pupils end up constricting is because we have some divergence going on, and this neuron is also going to decussate or cross over to the other side and synapse over here, send a signal out to the other eye, innervate the smooth muscle in the iris over there, and also cause that pupil in the other eye to constrict as well. And so that's why shining light in one eye makes both pupils actually constrict. So you can try that at home. Just do it kind of in a dim lighted room. Maybe go in the bathroom, turn the light off, maybe have the door open so you can at least see something. Let your pupils dilate a little bit and then shine the pen light into one eye, and then look in the mirror and you can actually see both eyes. Both pupils will constrict. Okay, so let's classify this reflex, the pupillary light reflex. So is this a spinal or cranial reflex? So this is actually a cranial reflex, isn't it? Because it involves the brainstem and also the cranial nerves. So this will be a cranial reflex. And is this a somatic or autonomic reflex? So this will be an autonomic reflex because you're innervating smooth muscle. Okay, somatic reflexes, you innervate skeletal muscle. Okay. And would this be a monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflex? Okay, so if we take a look here, our sensory neuron here is in green, and then we've got one synapse, two synapses between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron to this bottom eye, and then we've got one synapse, two synapses between this sensory neuron and the motor neuron to the other eye. So this would definitely be a polysynaptic reflex. And then would this be an innate or conditioned reflex? So this would definitely be an innate reflex. Okay, you don't have to learn how to do this. You're just born with all the wiring to do this, and so you don't have to be taught how to do this. Okay, so make sure you know how to classify reflexes. So if I give you a reflex, you could classify it with these 4 classifications. That would be important to know.